Hello, everyone, and welcome to this version of ONS Energy Talks. My name is Emil. I'm a mechanical engineer who's found my passion within CCS, carbon capture and storage, as well as the energy transition. Currently working as a business analyst in Aker Carbon Capture. And I had the pleasure of hosting the ONS conference when we went digital last year. And today we'll dive back into the topics of the energy transition, mainly focusing on the topic of trust between generations and what role that will play in the future of shaping the energy future. Today I'm joined here by a gentleman with decades of insight into the energy industry, having been with BP for more than 29 years, including 5 years as Group Vice President for Policy and Strategy Development. He's also been the economic advisor for Mr. Gordon Brown and visiting professor at King's College. He's also a close friend at ONS. So, Mr. Nick Butler, how are you doing?
Good morning. I'm fine. Great to be here. I'm only sorry I'm not in Norway.
Yeah, indeed. It's still digital these days, I guess, but good to see you. I think we'll just kick it off, Nick. So we'll talk a bit about trust here, but I think it's good to take one step back and talk about the pace of the energy transition as of today. Do you think the energy transition is moving fast enough?
I don't, I'm afraid. Looking at what's happening as we come out of the COVID recession around the world, you see that people are simply returning to their old habits. The recovery has begun in China, where the economy grew 18% in the first quarter of the year. And most of that growth is coal-fired. And what we are doing is talking about the long-term goals of net zero by 2050, which is great, but we have not yet put in place the infrastructure, the sort of things you're working on, which can create the opportunity for us to develop the economy again after the recession in a low carbon way. We don't have the infrastructure. Now I'm fascinated to hear how the carbon capture story is going. Are you really getting the costs down that are needed for it to be used around the world to the scale that would make a real difference?
It's a good question. I think we're on a good path here especially here in Europe, and you see all the projects popping up across, especially across Northern Europe, with the flagship here in Norway being Northern Lights, as well as what's happening in the Netherlands on Portos, as well as the Three Musketeers of storage and transport projects popping up. But I think it's a good point that it's easy to get caught in this European lens of progress when it comes to CCS. So it's interesting to see how, as you say, now in China, momentum is picking back up in the economy, and if that actually means that it's a change of trajectory towards actually managing your emissions to in terms of the energy transition, or if it's a economic growth perspective more than anything else. Why do you think could those two be combined?
I think they have to be combined. I mean, you talked about justice, trust between generations. I think the generation that we should really be focused on is the generation of people who will be born over the next 10, 20 years. They are going to be the main source of new emissions unless we can change the system. And I think at the moment, policy is far too focused on Europe and on the developed world, and not really looking at the solutions that are needed to reduce that potential growth in emissions over the next 2 decades. I mean, we're going to talk for 15, 20 minutes. I find it remarkable that in that time there will be something like 2,500, 3,000 more new citizens of the world born. Almost 250,000 every day, and most of them are in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and they're the people who need energy. They're beginning to be able to afford energy, and we've got to use our skills, as you're doing, to find the technology that can help them do that in a clean way. And that can't be hugely expensive. I think cost is now very important. We need low cost, low carbon solutions that are available to people who don't have much money, who are just coming out of poverty, but don't want to be pushed back down into poverty by very heavy costs. So that's the element of trust and climate justice that I think should focus on.
I agree, and I think also there's an additional dimension of the trust aspect. So we could talk about the people coming into this world now as consumers of the future of energy, but at the same time, I think also a reflection on my side is that it's now 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. I graduated the same year as the Paris Agreement was signed, actually. And for those who are coming out of university, out of schools, and actually choosing which way to go in life, I think it's important also to show that where can you make the biggest impact. If
Yeah.
you want to be part of building this momentum in the energy transition, where should you go to? And if you look at examples like School Strike for Climate, other events that's been happening over the last few years, I think it's a bit of a witness of the potentially lack of trust in some institutions from the younger generations. I know it's hard to say if it's a problem or if it's a good thing that that kind of momentum is created. But I think we can only have so much friction before we all align on the same direction and the same momentum. So I hope those people who actually stand in the streets for School for Climate are the same ones who join institutions, industry in actually making the transition happen and enabling that trust that they believe that companies and institutions who have set ambitious goals today are the right place to be for them. I think there's a trust aspect in there which is equally important because they are actually the ones who will make this transition happen. People who graduate today will have the next, yeah, basically less than 30 years. It's half a career in terms of making it happen and making it successful.
No, I totally agree with that. I think it is about delivery now. We have the right objectives, but I think it's totally understandable that people in that generation are very frustrated that not much is happening yet. If I were that young, I'd be frustrated too. But what worries me is that the frustration turns to distrust of all the existing institutions, governments, companies, financial investors, where you need those. In fact, they are all absolutely essential to get to an answer. I think the answer to this will come through things such as the carbon capture work you're doing, other people doing hydrogen, all sorts of initiatives going on. But I think it'll come through technology. And I find that generation distrust both technology in general and the companies who are going to deliver it. And I think that's a great shame. I always encourage students to go into those businesses and actually make the difference, because I think that's where change will actually come. Is the resistance, is the skepticism and distrust very strong in Norway?
No, I think a lot of young students today see the opportunity for actually being a part of kind of the moon landing of their generation by being part of this in either carbon capture, within renewables, within all the brilliant new technologies coming up also from the startup world. And I think also that's in Norway you see a big renaissance almost within the startup area. So I think it's also an aspect of showing that these established institutions and companies who will take some of the heavy lifting within the energy transition are nimble and fast moving enough that they can actually do this both on their own in collaboration and also able to create this entrepreneurial way of working which connects with I think many of my friends in my generation in terms of going in the same direction. I
Yes.
think when companies start to say we'll do this on our own, this is kind of our our playing field, will win this market share, etc., that's where we get into more of a friction that's led us into where we are today. And the more we go down the collaboration path, yeah, that's where we need to be.
What do you think is the next big step on this positive agenda?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a good question. The next big step, I think basically acknowledging the fact that I think you said it in our preparation here, Nick, that we must avoid a clean Europe in a dirty world. And it's a quote that really stuck with me. And to go from a place where we don't only look within our national borders in terms of the energy transition, both when it comes to politics and politicians, but also in terms of the risk we take in developing new technology. CCS is an example. The cost of CCS is higher than the cost of emitting carbon as of today. And I think the trust between government and companies in terms of the funding they provide, it's a moment in time. It's an opportunity given that we have right now, and we need to seize that, and we need to justify why this is the right thing to do. And the reason why it's the right thing to do is because we need to bring the cost of the green premium down, so countries outside of Europe can actually start applying this technology. And I think that aspect of the discussion is sometimes missing. We end up talking within our national boundaries within Europe, and we need to have more of a global focus in terms of bringing the cost down and enabling that technology to spread into the wider pieces of the world.
Yes.
I think that's the next focus, and that's where the focus should be.
Right.
What about you?
I knew you'd ask me back. What I'd love to see now is some of the companies who have revolutionized other sectors, or that sort of mindset, the Google, Amazon type of mindset, that you don't need to work in the old way, and that you can create a business in a very different way. I'd love to see them coming into this sector.
So do you think it's then the Microsofts and the Google who will actually go in and transform this sector, or will it be the companies who are already established in this sector who will apply the ways of working of Microsoft and Google?
Some of both. And it might not be the existing companies like Google or Apple or whoever. It might be two girls in a garage in Oslo who come up with great technology that actually transforms the sector and reduces costs. I think the whole thing will only actually be solved when you can reduce the cost of energy. I think you've got to undercut coal rather than force people to do things that they don't want to do. It's got to be an economically logical decision for people who don't have much money. And I think it just needs new thinking about the sector. I'm sure then that the big companies will pick it up. Equinor, BP, so on, they will pick it up. They might even invent it themselves. I hope so. But I think if we stick with the current architecture of the sector, it will be slower than if we have some really disruptive force that changes everything and forces everybody else to change.
It's a good point. I feel like there's almost an advice here, and we were to talk for about 15 minutes. It's closing down, so I would like to ask you, Nick, at the end, if you were back at the seat in BP, you were the head of strategy and were to set the course for the company for the next 5 years, under the context of what we've been talking about, what would be your advice? What would be your focus?
I think now I would split the company. I think I would take the old established business, which is very effective, and I think we're not going to give up on oil very quickly, but that business is actually producing and selling oil in a much more environmentally friendly way. But then I think the new business is about real change, and I think it's quite hard to sit under one umbrella. So I'd have a carbon futures business, which was cross-funded, but with different metrics of performance, actually driving towards the the change process. And I think that it would be better to have them somewhat separately run, and they get different investors, and they could do quite different things.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. I guess the people over at BP are taking notes as we speak. Will be interesting to see what's happening going forward. I think we're at time. So with that, Nick, thank you so much for the talk. So nice to meet you, and thank you for sharing your perspectives.
Pleasure. Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you. And thank you all for dialing in. Energy Talk from ONS will be back with more talks like this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you all. Take care, stay safe, and goodbye.